Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 411, Planned River Mouth Village. A lunch of exquisite and delicious food ended near evening. During the meal, Kant and James had a detailed discussion about the future planning, especially on the other side of the ancient passage, the new village that was to be built at the river mouth. This was Kant's third village. It was also the third stronghold of his force, a powerful castle that was about to be developed. Kant intended to build that new village into a castle with more prominent military uses. This was related to the distribution of his force. After all, the mouth of the river was where the dukedom of Leo, the Silver Platter Kingdom, and the Wildland intersected. There were also many hidden forces, such as the Crimson Sect, the water bandits of the Resnistican River, and the fleets of various human countries. It could be said that just by being at the mouth of the river, it was equivalent to being at the center of a storm. It was easy to build a village. It was also easy to develop. However, it was very hard to survive the malicious attacks from many forces. A city was a cluster of civilian buildings. Although there were also city walls and arrow towers to protect the outer shell, compared to a military castle that could be armed with the most sophisticated and sturdy city defense, a regular city was still slightly weaker in defense. The towering castle was the main body, and there were city walls and arrow towers as defense lines. Even if it were broken through, the castle itself could continue to resist the enemies. In the feudal era, the castle system of Western Europe was like a turtle shell that strengthened defense. During the period of cold weapons, even if there were millions of soldiers and all kinds of siege weapons, facing a well-built high-level castle, it would be still very hard to break through the castle despite only 1,000 soldiers were guarding it. The advantage in numbers was useless against such a huge stone building. Even if there were siege weapons, it would be the same. In the cold weapon era, no army could easily defeat the defending soldiers of the castle and completely occupy this military building that had an absolute position in the history of defense. Only in the era of thermal weapons, which was after the invention of cannons, did this phenomenon end. However, at that time, the castle had already evolved into a prism. The city walls were no longer tall. However, they were thick and heavy. The main body of the castle was no longer huge. However, the scattered military buildings could be closely connected. With the cannons of the defenders, the firearms of the footmen, and a well-built prism, it would not be a problem to defend against tens of times the enemy. It was the strong performance of European city defense. The current Kant's troop class was elite, but they were few in number. He could not achieve an advantage in troop size with short-term training of soldiers. This could not be compared to those forces with historical foundations. Kant was worried about the sea of people tactic. If 10 natives were exchanged for the lives of one soldier from the system, then it would be a loss for Kant. For Kant, it was a loss-making deal. Because in his force, there were only 10,000 soldiers. This was already his limit. After all, his population was only 25,000 people. It was equivalent to 2.5 civilians supporting one soldier, and more than half of them were cavalry. If it was not for the table salt trade that brought Kant an endless supply of dinar or the countless mount and blade worlds backing him up, Kant would have long collapsed in front of the huge military force that he was struggling to maintain. He would have completely lost the capital to conquer this world. This was the reason why Kant did not launch a direct attack on the dukedom of Leo. Once the existing trading system was destroyed or the planned dumping system for the colonies had not yet been established, it would be very troublesome to Kant. He could not maintain such a huge army. With the maintenance fee of nearly 100,000 dinars per week, Kant would not dare to take risks. It was really like dancing on the edge of a cliff. 100,000 dinars per week. That would be 400,000 dinars per month. The trade in table salt was conducted every 2 weeks, and each time it yielded 250,000 dinars. The monthly revenue was 500,000 dinars, but after taking out 400,000 for the maintenance of the army and taking out all the food that the army and the people consumed on a daily basis, as well as the miscellaneous expenses, there was basically not much dinar left. The possibility of recruiting a huge number of soldiers was not high in Kant's plan. Of course, he still needed to recruit more soldiers. The next step to deal with the siege of many enemies would be a bloody battle. Kant needed to quickly build a new village at the mouth of the river. At the same time, he also needed to quickly upgrade the village to a fortress, and finally level up to a castle as fast as possible. This was the only way to secure the area. However, others would not pretend to ignore it. The mouth of the river was very close to the Resnistikan River. If the merchant ships on the river looked to the north, they would be able to discover the new village at the mouth of the river. Furthermore, it was a bigger fortress or a huge castle. It was estimated that once the fortress was built, the enemy's attack would come. Therefore, Kant had to discuss it carefully. If the village was built, then he had to give it his all and upgrade this village to a very powerful fortress. If they were lucky, they could upgrade the fortress to the early stage of the castle before the enemies could react. It would be easier to deal with the enemies. Therefore, their task load was extremely heavy and all of it was placed on this city. Aaron, this city in the middle of the Sceneway range would be the backing of the new village. They talked all night long. Kant and James discussed until late at night before they went to rest. In the morning of the next day, there were desert bandits stationed at the mountain pass post house. They had already spurred their horses and galloped in the Naran desert. They were ready to head to the lookout Oasis, Trondheim Castle, to deliver the order. The Trondheim Castle was temporarily guarded by Bandit and Jocelyn. There were no abnormalities at the moment. But they didn't let down their guard either. Bandit had completely given the authority of the table salt trade to the former leader of the trade caravan, Jocelyn, and asked him to replace him in the table salt trade with the Stone Pass. As for Bandit, he led his troops to patrol the Naran Desert. With the Oasis lookout as the center and from the salt mine post house to the central post house, many troops were deployed. The large number of light cavalries mixed with a small number of elite heavy cavalry was extremely intimidating. However, these troops were indeed put in use, especially at the salt mine post house. These cavalries defeated many small groups of skeleton cavalries that were still trying to infiltrate here, protecting the newly built salt mine post house. In the vicinity of the central post house, there were also many spies sent by the Dukedom of Leo. The Naran Desert was already in danger. Kant's plan was to tear a hole in the predicament of being besieged, allowing his power to spread out and truly touch the side of the human countries. Using the various suspicions and instability of the human forces, in exchange for his rapid development in balance. Chapter 412, A Sudden War. Kant did not wait long in Aran City. As the desert bandits gave the order, the reinforcements from Trondheim Castle immediately set off. They were all cavalry troops with strong mobility. In just 7 days, they had arrived at the mountain pass post house. However, the troops that were mobilized this time were not the heavy cavalry of Kingdom of Swadia. They were the troops of the Saran Sultanate. 500 Mamluks, 1,500 Sarandian horsemen and 2,000 desert bandits had formed this cavalry unit. The appearance of their equipment made the valiant aura of these Saran Sultanate cavalry unquestionable. Their powerful aura circulated, and they weren't inferior to the troop class of the Kingdom of Swadia. They were also top-notch elites. They were the powerful cavalries that could face the enemy head-on and destroy all enemy. The Saran Sultanate was originally a strong cavalry country. Their top-notch cavalry troop, Mamluk, was second only to the Kingdom of Swadia's cavalry. Even the level 4 Sarandian horsemen was slightly weaker to the Swadian heavy cavalries and Kirgit Khanate's lance cavalries because their warhorse did not wear armor. However, they were still valiant as they belonged to the commando troop. On a battlefield, they could defeat every footman, including the Rhotic and Nord people. On a plain battlefield, cavalry was the true main force. At the hill where Kant was about to build a new village, apart from the Resnistikan River, the hill was actually covered by a vast plain area in all 4 directions. Cavalry was not the only force in a troop. Footmen were indispensable. A footman formation formed by the Rhodic people. Just like their reputation, they were tenacious and tough, just like the rocks in the Rhodic mountains. Heavy iron armor was draped over their bodies, thick shields were carried on their shoulders, heavy and sharp battle knives or one-handed battle hammers were slung over their waists, and heavy two-handed machetes like halberd were tied to their backs. They were just like human-shaped tanks. As he walked, the equipment collided with each other with a light sound. 500 Rhodic sergeants. 1,000 Rhodic veteran spearmen. 500 Rhodic veteran crossbowmen. This was the main infantry force that had been transferred from the Aran city, a city full of Rhodic people. Of course, there was also support from the Kingdom of Ravenstern. A total of 500 Ravenstone Rangers had also joined the Rhodic team to fill in the gaps of the crossbowmen. However, this filling in firepower was not inferior to the crossbowmen's heavy crossbows. They could shoot out the arrows as dense as an unstoppable rainstorm. Any enemy would be helpless against this group of elite archers. Perhaps these Ravenstern Rangers' single-cone arrows did not deal as much damage as the heavy crossbows of Rhodic veteran crossbowmen who used more powerful steel crossbow, but they were better at shooting out the arrows continuously. Each ranger was equipped with 60 all arrows. The shooting duration was longer. Together with the extremely powerful heavy crossbows, these two troops were simply a match made in heaven. Faced with the terrifying steel crossbow arrows, the enemies were shot through armor and fell to the ground in pain. The lucky ones scattered in fear, but they would not expect the even denser number of all arrows to follow closely behind them. The arrows continued to deal damage, and one by one, they were killed on the way forward. A total of 6,000 troops were about to set off. Aran City had even sent out many civilians to follow behind them. These were the supplies for the future. When the troops set off, the logistics line had to be guaranteed. The plan was well thought. In the ancient passage, the roads were perfect. Not only were there stone roads that were easy to march on, but there was also a waterway that could be used to transport supplies. As long as they had people to build a few simple rafts, they could transport supplies down the river. Of course, after the water bandits' lair was built, there would be special oars and warships to transport the supplies. Furthermore, there would be a transfer station for the supplies, the underground city. Kant had already arranged for people to go over and prepare to renovate the underground city. That underground city did not need extra buildings. If it were converted into a material storage and transfer station, as well as a logistics point, it would be fine. No matter what happened, they would be able to provide timely support. After all, the underground city was only a little more than a day's journey from the river mouth. This was just the speed of riding a horse. If they traveled by water, it would be even faster. When the time came, the underground city that was once the ancient god's descendant shelter and sealed land would become the crucial middle station between the Aran city and the new village. A large number of resources would pass through this station and continuously reach the village. At the same time, at certain moments of crisis, the entire village could retreat and enter the underground city to temporarily hide from danger. As long as they waited for the reinforcement to arrive, they would be able to counterattack at any time. This was also Kant and James's plan. The plan was also being carried out in an orderly manner as time passed. Large number of resources drifted down smoothly with the raft and directly reached the underground city. Then, they would be transported ashore by the peasant farmers who were waiting there with hooks and piled up in the temporary warehouse. The troops that had been mobilized had already moved into the underground city. Torches were lit. The entire underground city was brightly lit. The temporary transit command center had been set up, and Kant and James were temporarily stationed here. At the same time, when Kant went to the river mouth to build a new village, James would also be stationed here for a short period of time, using the resources from Aran City to fully supply the expenses and development of the new village. Everything went very smoothly. However, accidents still happened. Elite desert bandit were covered in blood and rode their horses over. With an anxious face, they half knelt in front of Kant, they quickly reported, "Lord Kant. Just 2 days ago, we encountered an attack from the forces of the Crimson Sect. Lord Rolf has already forced back the enemy's attacks several times, but they are coming aggressively, and their numbers are increasing. We can no longer hold on." "What?" Kant was slightly stunned. He had yet to react. Those fellows of the Crimson Sect actually dared to directly launch an attack on him. This made him not know whether to laugh or cry. The powerful troops were right behind him. They could set off at any time. But those fellows of the Crimson Sect were really brainless. They really thought that they could defeat Kant. Taking the initiative to attack him, they were simply tired of living. "I understand." Kant nodded. The figure who was originally sitting behind the table also stood up and ordered in a deep voice, "Gather all the troops. The target is the river mouth. Get ready to set off." "Yes." The desert bandits who served as the messenger immediately received the order and left. Immediately, the voice spread throughout the underground city. The troops gathered. "Let's go." Chapter 413, The Strength of the Reinforcements. The troops that were already prepared immediately set out. A rumbling sound could be heard. It was the orderly footsteps stepping on the solid stone pavement. The cavalry with better mobility set out first. Groups of desert bandits spread out. As the scouts, the cavalries charged at the front. Behind them were the Sarandian horsemen as well as the most elite heavy armored cavalry, Mamluks. Kant personally led the footmen and walked forward quickly, forming a snake-like formation. The 6,000-man army was not a small number. In the dukedom of Leo, the main force that was gathered was about the same number. Of course, Kant also understood that the troops gathered by the richest South County were actually better equipped than his 6,000-man troop. For example, the largest number of desert bandits, the multi-purpose light cavalry, was obviously the most backward. Especially the equipment. Desert bandits were still equipped with leather armor. It wasn't even inlaid with iron armor, it was the simplest scale armor. The shield was also the most ordinary scale armor. It was simply covered with a thin layer of leather on the round wooden shield to reduce the impact of the attack and increase the sturdiness of the shield itself. It was also the simplest upgrade version of the round wooden shield. Perhaps the only things that were worthy of praise were the short pilum on their backs and the scimitar in their hands. These were the top-notch weapons. As for the desert horse that a desert bandit rode on, it was also an ordinary horse, not a war horse. It was still inferior to the Sarandian horse that rode by the Sarandian horsemen. The only advantage it had was it had adapted to the desert environment. However, outside of the desert and desert terrain, it was actually no different from the horses that ordinary people rode on the plains. It was just a different kind of traveling horse. The desert bandits were far inferior to the main force of the dukedom of Leo. The knights and knight attendants formed a knight regiment. It could be said that almost all of the knight attendants could be considered as assault knights like the Sarandian horsemen. As for the more elite knights, because of the outstanding finances of the dukedom of Leo's southern county, they were also covered in heavy armor. They were similar to the Swadian cavalry and the Swadian knight. They were the absolute tanks that pressed forward on the land. They walked and stopped, and with the strict marching speed, they were relaxed and disciplined along the way. The situation at the mouth of the river was critical. However, they definitely could not be so flustered that they could ignore everything. Kant was very calm, because he knew that in the team at the mouth of the river, not only Rolf, the general who was good at commanding battles, there were also 10 Sarlian Lion Knights as high-end combat strength to hold the line. Just these 10 Sarlian Lion Knights were enough to defend against at least 300-man troop. In addition, there were nearly 500 elite desert bandit. Defending the river mouth was very simple. Kant did not believe that those guys from the Crimson Sect could easily break through Rolf's defense line. Although there would definitely be casualties during this period of time, how could there not be casualties in a war? Those elite desert bandits were in fact ready to sacrifice themselves. In their eyes, their deaths were valuable and worthy of praise. The troops marched. 3 days later, they finally reached the exit of the ancient passage, which was also the river mouth. They arrived as expected time. After all, the footmen slowed down the speed of the march. Just based on the cavalry's march, they could reach the river mouth in 1 day. Of course, footmen couldn't. They were fully armed. They carried all kinds of supplies. Using 2 legs to reach the river mouth in 3 days was already amazing. This was also due to the excellent roads. If it were the rugged dirt roads in the North County and East County, they could probably reach the mouth of the river in a week. Moreover, there would be people who would hurt their ankles due to the rugged roads. This was a fact. Could the roads in the feudal era be compared to the wide and smooth asphalt roads in modern times? However, when they reached the mouth of the river, the intense battle cries were already transmitted from the outside. The battle was very intense, so much so that at the mouth of the cave, there were people moving around. Many wounded people covered in blood were also dragged back from the front line. There were even many people directly lying on the side of the mouth of the cave. There were nearly 100 of them. They were all elite desert bandits. The iron-plated scale armor on their bodies were all tattered. It was obvious that they had suffered heavy injuries. "My lord," desert bandits quickly reported from the front, "the enemy is attacking the entrance of the cave." "Yes." Kant frowned and asked in a deep voice, "How is the battle situation? How are Rolf and the Lion Knights? Why do I see that the outer positions have basically been lost? Have they all retreated into the tunnel?" "Yes, my lord, the battle situation is intense." The desert bandit continued, "The enemy is the Crimson Sect's troops. They are mainly lance soldiers. They even brought ballistae to attack the us. They have completely suppressed the cavalries led by Rolf. They can only let a small number of cavalries guard the entrance of the cave. He and a team of cavalries have left here to engage in guerrilla warfare and pin down the enemy who is attacking the entrance of the cave." "Okay." Kant's face returned to its usual calm. After pondering for a moment, he did not hesitate. He waved his hand and gave the order, "Rhotic footmen, prepare to advance. Take the lead and take the position outside the cave entrance. Get into formation and stop the enemy from attacking further." He continued, "Rhotic sharpshooter, continue to attack. Take the lead and kill the enemy's ballista operators." "Yes," an orderly response came from behind. Rhotic sergeant and the captain of Rhotic veteran spearmen gave their orders. As the orderly footsteps continued to ring out, these footmen dressed in heavy armor, holding large shields, long spears, and halberd in their hands. They quickly pushed forward. They passed the cavalry and quickly arrived at the entrance of the cave. Raising their shields, they raised their spears and machetes in front of them, protecting the elite desert bandits behind them. Clanging sounds rang out. The thick shields completely blocked off any attacks from the enemies. They could defend against arrows and spears attack from the enemies. After all, this was the shield that the Rhotic people were most proud of. It could easily withstand the spears of the Swadian, the flying axes of the Nords, the bardic of the Vaegirs, the sharp arrows of the Kurgits, and the machetes of the Sarandon. "Kill!" Following the captain's angry roar, most of the Rhotic sergeants and the veteran spearmen continued to advance in silence. They were like the rocks in the Rhotic mountains, advancing step by step, creating a bloody path. The enemies outside the cave, who had already taken the initiative, panicked and began to retreat step by step. The lance soldiers of the Crimson Sect, who were wearing mail armor, holding long spears, and black robes, did not react in time. Or rather, they did not think that there would be reinforcements appeared from the entrance of the cave. They had originally thought that this was just a relic, a dead end. Originally, they had surrounded this group of people was like catching a turtle in a jar. Moreover, there were ballistae and archers as the powerful firepower to support the formation. The lance soldiers pressed forward step by step, waiting for the final victory. But who would have thought that the reinforcements would appear, and they were actually elite spearmen who wore such fine armor and had thick and heavy shields. Those large shields were raised side by side and formed a formation. They were like a low wall. For a moment, the pressure made the Crimson Sex Lancers dare not continue forward. Instead, they retreated. Because in the gaps of the low wall, long spears that were like poisonous snakes thrusting out. The 3-meter-long spear and the sharp tip of the spear were extremely deadly. Chapter 414, Declaration of the End of the Battle. The Rhodoc people had studied the spear, but they had reached the point where they had gone mad. This was no wonder. After all, right next to them was the kingdom of Swadia, where cavalry was their main force in battles. Only by relying on the complicated geographical location of the mountain region of Kingdom of Rhodocs, could they obstruct the heavy cavalries of the Kingdom of Swadia. However, if they wanted to defeat their former suzerain, they had to develop an army that could restrain the heavy cavalry. The heavy armor and spear footmen were the troop class that these Rhodoc people chose. Reality proved that they were extremely useful. They continued to develop their excellent defense. The dense troops formed a solid defensive line that was like a mountain rock. Together with the sharp spear, they pressed layer upon layer towards the enemy's formation. They were not greedy for merit and did not advance rashly. From time to time, there would be crossbowmen who held heavy crossbows to counterattack. Their combat strength was extremely terrifying. At the very least, under such a formation, many kingdoms in the entire continent of Karadia were helpless against them. They were like the porcupines made of rocks. They could not charge through them. They could not bite through them. There were more sharp external spikes. If the enemies accidentally charged to this Rhodoc formation, they would be in an even more miserable situation. For example, the Crimson Sex Lancers could only press against the tower shield when they stabbed forward with their spears. However, they still had to worry about the sharp spears piercing through the shield formation. The sharp cold spears were extremely deadly. They were aimed at the throat, chest, and thighs, which had weaker defense. In a short moment, dozens of Crimson Sex Lancers fell to the ground, howling in pain. Then, the Rhodoc footmen behind the tower shield pushed forward step by step and pressed over. They squeezed out a space and arrived in front of the injured spearmen who were lying on the ground. Then, the footmen smashed them by one-handed war hammers. Their skulls were cracked, and they were directly smashed until blood flowed out of their 7 orifices. They could not be more dead. Their methods were cruel. They did not even leave any survivors. This made the Crimson Sex spearmen even more terrified. People were all afraid of the Crimson Sex Lancers. In fact, they were the lance-wielding soldiers that Viscount Gibran had trained in Avilis Castle. However, they had been transferred to Mountain of Death and became the Crimson Sex private soldiers. They were not the elite troop class of the Crimson Sect. They were just the squire troops guarding the periphery of Mountain of Death. There was no need for them to risk their lives for the Crimson Sect. Therefore, they were retreating. Moreover, they knew that 2 ballistae were waiting behind them. There were still more than 200 strong archers. They could completely form the formation of the ballistae. The strong archers could cover and fire, turning these heavy armored Rhodoc spearmen, who had amazing defense but were very slow, into a dead porcupine. At the back, the commander of the Crimson Sex Lancers thought the same thing. His eyes were slightly scarlet. The aura of the devil was circulating around him. He was a superior from Mountain of Death, a member of the Crimson Sect. Because the devil general had given him great power, he, who was once a peasant, was now able to control this army. He was an absolute loyalist to Crimson Sect. That was why he personally led the army here. As long as he massacred this group of cavalries that had once heavily injured Viscount Gibran, he would be able to obtain even greater power when he returned. When he thought of this, he could not help but tremble with excitement and fanaticism. As he gave the order, the lancers at the front continuously retreated and spread out, making way for the ballistae at the rear. The lances were already placed on top of the 2 ballistae as the projectiles. The powerful lance could be shot out like an arrow. Even the thick tower shield would not be able to block it. It would directly pierce through the body of the person behind it, nailing the mighty heavy armored soldier to the ground. He would slowly die with a mournful wail. This was a siege weapon. In the field, its power was like an ancient version of a cannon. But before it could be fired, groups of crossbowmen rushed out quickly from the cave. They were all Rhotic veteran crossbowmen. They held the best heavy crossbows in their hands. They quickly walked to the side of the cave and lined up in formation. In an extremely short period of time, they pulled the trigger. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh! The sound of the steel crossbow bolts tearing through the air was incessant. And within a range of 100 meters, the ballista, which was originally in an absolutely safe position, had been destroyed. The steel bolts were like a torrential rain, instantly piercing over. The operators, who had not had the time to react, were instantly pierced through by the steel bolts. The leather armor on their bodies could not withstand it. One by one, they retreated in pain and collapsed on the ground. Then, they died horribly painful. As for the operators who were lucky enough to survive after hiding behind the ballista, they watched all of this in horror. They threw down the tools in their hands and fled to the back. Faced with such accurate shooting, no one dared to continue stay at their position. They did not need to risk their lives. However, behind them, the Crimson Sect's barrier troop dressed in black robes appeared on their escape route. The commander with a gloomy expression waved his hand. He waved his long sword and slashed the escaping operators. Instantly, the heads and necks of the operators were separated, and they were killed on the spot, intimidating the soldiers whose morale had already been shaken. The rule of the Crimson Sect itself was based on terror. This method was very normal. However, even with the existence of the barrier troop, it was still unable to raise the already depressed morale. This was because the heavy armored long lance soldiers with tower shields had already advanced, causing the Crimson Sect's long lance soldiers to be forced to retreat. They had no intention of resisting at all, not to mention that they did not have any means to resist. Among them, the one with the best equipment was wearing mail armor. Most of them were wearing iron scale armor. However, against the existence in front of them that was obviously a troop of elite footmen, what could they use to resist? It was impossible. At the entrance of the cave, more troops appeared. The archers with bows climbed to the top of the hill, followed by a continuous rain of arrows that covered the bodies of the lance-wielding soldiers. However, when the Crimson Sect's archers wanted to counterattack, they were immediately scattered by the steel bolts. They had completely lost the ability to fight. Their morale was extremely low. Moreover, there were close to 200 light cavalry soldiers on the periphery who were still running around and attacking them. From time to time, short pylons would be thrown at them. If anyone was left behind, the desert bandits would form into a group and pull out their scimitars. They charged forward with their spears and slaughtered all the soldiers of the Crimson Sect who were alone. What's going on? The commander of the Crimson Sect had a look of madness and despair in his eyes. This should have been his victory, but he did not expect that there would be so many reinforcements from the mouth of the cave. He did not believe that there would be so many troops hidden inside. Perhaps, the mouth of the cave was actually an underground passage. His guess was correct. But it was useless. Just at the hole, Kant had already led a large number of cavalries to rush out. Along with the roar of the war horses, more and more desert bandits pounced out and spread out towards the empty plains beside them. Among them were the Sarandian horsemen with excellent equipment, as well as the fully armored Mamluks. This battle, which had continued for several days, could finally be declared over. Chapter 415, The defeated soldiers chose to surrender. The soldiers rushed out of the ancient passage and formed up on the plains of the East County. Mamluks, who were as wearing heavy armor including their horses, were in the front while the Sarandian horsemen were behind. The desert bandits, who were slightly poorly equipped, spread out their short pylons on both wings and began their attack with a loud rumble. The galloping of the 3,000 cavalries made the ground seem as if it was shaking, as if it was an earthquake. The Crimson Sect's lance soldiers drew back in fear. No one stopped them. Even the Devil Cult members, who were supposed to be the barrier troops, drew back as well. In other words, this so-called drew back was more appropriate to call it a retreat. They were panicking and did not dare to face this cavalry troop, which was at least 3 times larger than their own. They were running away in fear. The troop of Crimson Sect was completely collapsed. Their dense spear formation formed by the lance soldiers could indeed restrain the cavalries. However, if there were too many cavalries that outnumbered their own footmen, then even this so-called lance formation would eventually become a fragile turtle shell that was easily broken. Sooner or later, it would shatter. There was no way to obstruct the cavalry's path of charge. They could not even achieve the achievement of stepping stones. Facing the charge of 3,000 cavalries, it felt like the earth was shaking and the mountains were collapsing. Countless hooves were pounding on the ground, and the rumbling sound was like a rolling thunder. The footmen who weren't mentally prepared couldn't stay calm in front of this cavalry group. At the very least, these Crimson Sect's lance soldiers couldn't remain calm. They were only mercenaries who were paid to do things. Although they were also lance soldiers trained by a villous castle, it didn't mean that they were willing to be loyal to the Crimson Sect. They were not willing to work for this terrifying cult unconditionally. Last month, they still didn't know that the true controller of Mountain of Death was the Crimson Sect. Originally, they had been trained by a villous castle to guard this mountain. In name, they were here to prevent the invasion of the North County and South County, as well as to serve as a reserve team to defend against the invasion of the Silver Platter Kingdom. As for the demonic sect or the Crimson Sect, they didn't have much thought about it. It didn't matter. After all, they were paid to do things. It was better to protect their homes and protect the East County. As the original residents of this place, they naturally had a deep love for their homes. However, they didn't expect that in less than a month's time, Viscount Gibran, who had lost an arm, would come to Mountain of Death. The Crimson Sect that had been secretly preaching was suddenly in charge. The entire world seemed to have undergone an earth-shaking change. The Crimson Sect members with terrifying power had also appeared on Mountain of Death. They were stronger than the trained lance soldiers. After that, they had nothing to do with it. They were all driven away. However, they were not let go. Instead, they came to the foot of the mountain to be responsible for guarding it and became the outer defense line. They were once led by their middle-level and high-level commanders, but in reality, these commanders had become the Dark Red Cult's believers at some point in time. Only the soldiers at the bottom level were deceived, and they waited at a loss. Then, they came to this moment. They were strangled by Kant's cavalries on the road of escape. A large number of corpses appeared on the east side of the small river beside them. Not far away, on the Resnistikan River, there were more than a dozen large transport ships. They hurriedly pulled open their sails and fled down the river. They did not even care about their own people who had yet to board the ships on the shore. In a short moment, over 1,000 Crimson Sect's lance soldiers were annihilated. There were still over 400 smart people who threw away their weapons. They knelt on the ground and raised their hands. They did not dare to move and chose to surrender. Their expressions were extremely respectful. However, looking at their trembling bodies, they knew that they were extremely afraid. However, they were indeed safe. No one cared about them. War horses swept past them. A cold glint of scimitars and spears flashed past their heads. The cold chill made their backs break out in cold sweat, but fortunately, their surrender also brought them temporary safety. They were not massacred. Groups of cavalry stopped their charging footsteps on the riverbank of the Resnistikan River. Behind them were the corpses of those who dared to resist. There were also those who knelt down and chose to surrender. One by one, the desert bandits used hemp ropes to tie up the surrendered soldiers. Hence, there was a new labor force on the salt mine in the depths of the Naran Desert, which could be used to mine coarse salt. Ever since the last invasion of the undead and the death of all the salt mining slaves, the output of salt had not increased. Using the famers from the system for mining were too expensive. It was better to use slaves. These captives were very docile, especially when faced with the threat of death. They could often burst forth with extremely high labor standards. In order to survive, these people would do anything. Of course, this so-called survival also meant that they would submit to Kant. If they became captives and slaves, they would lose their dignity. Take them away. Rolf also urged his horse over. Behind him were the elite desert bandit who were covered in blood, and everyone was injured. Looking at these captives, he looked disgusted by them. He even used his horsewhip to ruthlessly whip those dark red cult disciples. He pointed at those fellows whose eyes were suffused with red light but still was afraid. He said fiercely, "As for these cult disciples, don't keep them. Kill them all. They aren't good people. No. We surrender. Don't kill us. We surrender." The followers of the Crimson Sect immediately cried and howled. But no one cared. A few elite desert bandits dismounted, raised the scimitars in their hands, and fiercely hacked down. The heads of the followers of the Crimson Sect were chopped off one by one. They let their heads roll on the ground like rubber balls. Blood spurted out of their necks, and their bodies convulsed as they fell to the ground. They were completely dead. The disciples of the Crimson Sect, whose hands were bound by the thick hemp rope, had no ability to resist at all. But there was an exception. Just as one of the elite desert bandit came to the side of a burly disciple, that disciple instantly exploded. Although his entire body was bound by the hemp rope, a force directly broke the hemp rope. He picked up a long sword on the ground beside him and pierced through the chest of the elite desert bandit. A blood-red aura burst out from his body as he rushed towards the river. He was a grand knight with extraordinary strength. But he was fast. The two figures behind him who had also burst out with blood-red aura were even faster. The Sarlian lion knight rode his horse and rushed over. The knight sword in his hand was aimed at the grand knight's back. Before he could react, he was cut into two pieces by the sword that contained powerful strength. His body was separated. Rolf narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the elite desert bandit who had fallen to the ground with some regret. However, there was a hint of relief in his eyes. Because of that grand knight they killed was the commander of the Crimson Sect who had brought troops to attack them. Chapter 416, Obtained Kingdom of Nords. Previously, this commander had relied on the lance soldiers and strong archers, as well as the ballistae that could pierce through stones. He did not put Rolf and his light cavalry troop in his eyes at all. Perhaps the reason why he did not charge at them directly was because of the 10 Sarlian lion knights. So, he chose to slowly wear down Rolf and his troop. If Kant had not brought reinforcements in time, Rolf and his troop would probably be trapped within the ancient passage in less than 2 days, completely losing the space to move around in the East County. Although it would be safe by then, it would definitely be troublesome. After all, the exit of the passage was blocked by the enemies. When that time came, whether the enemies smoked them out or slowly approached them, the light cavalries could not deal with them easily. Especially in the narrow space, the cavalry's mobility was greatly restrained. They could only be turned into fish meat on a chopping board. But it was all over now. Kant rode his horse over with the reinforcement. His 10 lion knights were also protecting him at the side. They looked at the captives who were tied up with their hands behind their backs, their expressions very grave. No one knew if there were more assassins hiding inside. "What's going on?" Kant asked. He glanced at the corpse that had been cut into two and frowned slightly. "This guy is actually a grand knight. This is really unexpected. If it wasn't for the lion knights who noticed it earlier, he would have escaped into the river and left this place." "That's right. I really didn't expect this." Rolf's face was also filled with relief. This grand knight, the commander of the Crimson Sect, was not surrender. If it wasn't for the fact that he was hiding among the surrendering people and taking the opportunity to attack Kant, Rolf definitely wouldn't have believed it. After all, the reason these guys launched an attack was because they already knew that Kant, the Lord of the Naran Desert, was here. But they just didn't expect that the entrance of the ancient passage was not a cave, but a passage that connected to the Sinway range. The passage that the ancient gods' descendants had built to connect to the shelter. These Crimson Sect people deserve to die. Rolf also came back to his senses. He said with an angry face, "These fanatics are all crazy. Although they look calm, we don't know when they will go crazy. We captured a few of them in the beginning, and then when they went crazy, they could also break the hemp rope. They are like crazy people who don't fear death. Even if they die, they will drag others to death. Poor people bewitched by demons." Kant nodded, but there was no hint of pity in his tone. "They deserved to die." "Yes." Rolf nodded. "That's why I ordered the execution of these fanatics after they were captured. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to deal with them when their demonic power recovers and they become madmen." Kant did not blame him. Instead, he praised, "Well done. Thank you." Rolf put his hand on his chest and bowed. However, he still turned his head and looked at the troops behind him who were all walking out of the ancient passage. There was a hint of fanaticism on his face. "It looks like you're thinking of directly attacking East County City, Lord Kant." "No, just a little warning," Kant said calmly. "Warning?" Rolf was puzzled. "Yes," Kant said, "next, I will build a new village here and turn this village into a fortress or castle in the shortest time possible. During this period of time, I don't want outsiders to disturb me. This is also why I brought these guys here to announce my military strength." "I understand." Rolf nodded. "You lead the team." Kant ordered, "I'll leave these desert bandits to you. Spread out and form an investigative cavalry. I also need to let those who still have ulterior motives know that those who dare to come here will die." "Yes." Rolf immediately nodded. Following Rolf's command, groups of desert bandits immediately spread out. There were many of them, just like a pack of wolves. If there were enemies, they would quickly gather together, bared their fangs, and fiercely bite those enemies. The desert bandits in Saran Sultanate were not much weaker than the horse bandits in Kirgit Khanate. Or it could be said that the system of these bandits was complementary to each other. The two countries were already connected. If the desert bandits spread out like a pack of wolves, their safety could also be guaranteed. Moreover, right at the mouth of the river, Rhodic footmen had already started to set up camp and set up a temporary camp. They expanded the surrounding grassland to accommodate more people. A new village was about to appear. "Build a village." Kant communicated with the system. Immediately after, the system gave a reply. "Ding system prompt. Detected that there is already a council hall. The faction is the Kingdom of Swadia. The level is castle level. Detected that there is already a council hall. The faction is the Kingdom of Rhodux. The level is city level. This time, the construction of the council hall will be randomly selected. The level is village level. Yes/no? Yes." Kant made his choice. He already knew this. The system dialog box instantly refreshed. A new notification box appeared. Ding system prompt. Random selection of factions. Please pause at will. On the retina before his eyes, the dialog box directly turned into a disk. Countless factions' names appeared densely on it. Although he was relatively small, as Kant scanned through it, he could vaguely find many familiar names. Kingdom of Swadia, Kingdom of Rhodux, Kingdom of Nords, Kingdom of Vaigirs, Kingdom of Saran Sultanate, Kingdom of Sarleon, Kingdom of Ravenstern, Kingdom of Fierdsvane, the D-Shar Principalities, Imperial Expeditionary Force, Jeta Tribe, and Noldor Elf Force. Even the Great Ming Empire, Manchurian Jurchen, Mongolian Golden Family, Great Han Empire, Xiongnu Empire, Oda Nobunaga, Usuji Kenshin, Southern European countries, Northern European countries, Eastern European countries, and even Middle East countries. All ages, all regions, all kinds of formal history or fantasy world. All existed on this disk. This was the factions that contained in all the mods in the entire Mount and Blade. Kant took a deep breath. The disk was spinning. The name of the power on it was no longer clear. He was calm. Stop. Following his words, the disk stopped abruptly. The red pointer aimed at the name of a force on the disk. Ding system prompt. Congratulations on obtaining the Council Hall of Kingdom of Nords. The system dialog box appeared in reality on his retina. Kant was slightly stunned. It was the Council Hall of the Kingdom of Nords. This powerful country, which was established in the northern coastal area of the continent of Karadia. It was originally a colony of a powerful Nord nation overseas. However, with the independence of its generals, it eventually merged into the continent of Karadia. The powerful Kingdom of Nords finally showed its ferocity in this world. Chapter 417, The Construction of the Water Bandit Lair. The Village of the Kingdom of Nords. Kant was slightly stunned, but he looked at the council hall that had already appeared beside the hill. It was made entirely of wood and a few pieces of stone. At the corner, there was cornices with the ocean style, just like a long boat. The Nords had crossed the sea. Initially, they had come to the continent of Karadia in the form of water bandits and pirates. At first, they had brought a lot of trouble to the original Karadia Empire. Slowly, their population increased. More and more Nords knew that there was still the continent of Karadia outside their mainland. They crazily organized fleets and formed expeditionary fleets in the name of Kingdom of the Nords. They came to this pure land in a mighty way. They launched a surprise attack on the unprepared and defenseless Karadia Empire. The attack came from the ocean and rivers. They defeated the ancient Karadia Empire. Even the capital of the Karadia Empire had been seized by the Nords, becoming the capital of the Kingdom of Nords, the present-day Sargath. However, the Kingdom of Karadia also fell into a split. The Vaegirs also crossed the Great Snowy Mountains and arrived at the continent of Karadia, starting a war with the newly split Kingdom of Swadia. However, it was also worth celebrating. Very quickly, the two enemies of the Kingdom of Swadia began to view each other as enemies. The Nord and Vaegirs began a bloody battle. Just as the main forces of the two kingdoms converged in Revaden, they fought on the city walls for several days. Countless people died in the battle. Even the highest commander sent by the Nord Empire to the continent of Karadia was dead. In the end, they had no choice but to withdraw from Revaden, ceding control of the city to the Kingdom of Swadia. This battle had also caused the expedition army of the Nord Empire to officially break away from their control and declare independence on the continent of Karadia. They had established the famous Kingdom of Nords. However, the impact of the battle was rather deep. The main forces of the two countries had almost completely annihilated each other. The mutual hostility between them had also allowed the Kingdom of Swadia to complete its regrouping. They had regrouped. Although they were not as glorious as the previous Karadia Empire, they were still at the center of the continent, possessing the vast majority of fertile lands and cities. They were still beginning to radiate new vitality. The six countries were temporarily at peace, but danger lurked everywhere. There was constant friction in the dark. If any contradictions were to be triggered again, the flames of war would be ignited again. However, the war would not continue to appear for the time being. This was because Kant's reputation had already spread throughout the entire continent of Karadia. From the elderly to the children, from the king to the peasant, everyone already knew about this supreme lord from the land of miracles. The glory that shone like the sun. The soldiers were able to die for Kant and obtain the supreme honor. The commoners were able to live under Kant's rule with incomparable joy and happiness. They were all die-hard loyalists. The Nords who came here were the same. They looked at their surroundings that had been turned upside down. It was no longer the swampy and low-lying area beside the sea. Their faces were filled with surprise and joy. When they saw Kant, they instantly understood everything and quickly came over to greet him. "Great Supreme Lord," the 10 Nord peasants bowed. If it weren't for the fact that they didn't worship on their knees and weren't qualified to use the half-kneeling ceremony that only nobles and knights could use, they would have already used the highest respect they could think of to salute Kant. However, Kant didn't care. He calmly said, "All right, I'm glad that you guys are here. It's our honor." They answered excitedly. A small interlude. The construction of the village could be done at an extremely fast speed. Kant had already gotten used to it. As he communicated with the system in his mind, he immediately used this council hall as the center. Blurry white lines appeared in front of his eyes. They were all the outlines of the buildings that had been planned beforehand. About 100 Nord traditional houses were neatly arranged around the council hall. There was also the city wall. It directly encircled all the houses, hills, and some small rivers. According to Kant's plan, with the river as the boundary, the east side was the residential area, and the west side was the military area. After the fortress wall or castle was built, the area would be directly expanded to cover all the surrounding areas. This was the border between the East County and the wildland on the west side. The terrain was flat. But it was unusually desolate. No matter how Kant encircled the land, it did not matter. After all, from here to the east, it would require more than 3 hours of house riding to reach here from the nearest farm around. This was enough to tell the distance. After all, it would not take more than 10 minutes to ride a horse to the riverbank of the Resnistikan River. Build the water bandit lair. Kant's mind did not stop. As his mind continued to communicate with the system, the golden card in his mind suddenly shattered into golden light. It floated in the outside world and condensed in the military zone on the west side of the river. Soon, a prototype of a building appeared on the riverbank. It was about 2 stories tall, but its length was about 50 meters, similar to the long houses of the Nordic people on Earth. But it was completely inappropriate to say that it was a building. Because it was right on the river. There was a 50-meter long and 20-meter wide bend on the river bank. There was also a well-built dock on it. There were 3 of them. It seemed that they could dock 6 long ships. Even Kant's impression, it could dock 3 of the biggest merchant ships on the Resnistikan River. But this was the dock where the warships were docked. This was the lair of the water bandits. The vicious water bandits who once roamed the kingdom of Nords. They came and went like the wind in their paddling warships, rampaging in the river. They even went deep into the hinterland of the continent of Karadia, causing great harm to the kingdom of Swadia, the kingdom of Nords, and even the kingdom of Vaigirs in the deepest part of the continent. These vicious, greedy Nord water bandits did not know what a country and race was. In addition, there were other local bandits joining in. It was almost a disaster. Initially, they were still under the control of the expedition fleet of the Nord Empire. They even acted as guides for the expedition fleet, destroying the most prosperous town, Zendar. However, as the expedition army of the Nord Empire fought with the kingdom of Vaigirs in Revaden city, both sides suffered heavy losses, and their commanders died in battle. This group of water bandits was like a warhorse that had lost its reins, completely free and plunged into the darkness. They became bandits that were unstable in several kingdoms. Water Bandits Lair. Recruitable, 30 water bandit minions per week. Recruitment fee, 10 dinars. Maintenance fee, 1 dinar. Equipment, leather armor, butcher knife. Level up, water bandit bosun. Final level up, water bandit captain. Buildable, paddle sailboat, 500 dinars 35 crew members, no weapons. Buildable, 3 warships, 2000 dinars 70 crew members, 2 ballistae. The system provided detailed information on the buildings. Kant raised his eyebrows slightly. This was a pleasant surprise. He did not expect that this water bandit Lair could actually build 2 types of warships while recruiting water bandits. This clearly guaranteed that he could directly extend his force into the Resnistican River in the future. Chapter 418, Temporary Military Center. Without any hesitation, Kant directly recruited the 30 water bandits that were allowed to be recruited this week. Within the water bandit Lair, 30 water bandit minions wearing simple leather armor and carrying butcher knives at their waists immediately walked. Of them had an unruly expression on their faces, and they did not look like good people. They were indeed not good people. They roamed the rivers where the various countries intersected, kidnapped, extorted, and killed merchant ships to attack villagers. They did all kinds of evil deeds. But Kant did not care. Just like how he could accept the Saran Sultanate's desert bandits. These ferocious water bandits from the kingdom of Nords were also people he could accept. As long as they played an important role in his army, it did not matter even if they were the main force. In fact, these water bandits could indeed be the main force, because they were Kant's only water army. Kant had a lot of troops. For example, footmen, cavalry, archers, and so on. But for the water army, it was extremely rare. Especially now that he had extended his force to the Resnistican River, which was the most important river in the human kingdoms, the existence of the water army was especially important. Fortunately, Kant already had a building that could recruit a water army. Water bandit Lair. These bandits that roamed the river were very suitable for the current situation. They were similar to the traditional water bandits of the river, but in terms of fierce fighting strength, they were even stronger than the water bandits that were bullied by the human kingdoms. After all, the Kant's water bandits were actually light-armored pirates. They were bandits with experience in plundering. If they were able to upgrade their armor, or to be more precise, level up, they were not inferior to the pirates. In fact, the bosun and captain of these water bandits were actually the Nord pirates. They had drifted from the distant Nords Empire, formed a group of poor people, and became pirates who robbed houses and made a fortune. After that, they turned around and cleaned themselves up. It didn't matter whether they went to live in the kingdom of Nords or returned to the Nords mainland. After all, to the Nords, the continent of Karadia was actually a colony. No one asked where they came from. Even if they knew that they were water bandits in the past, they would be accepted harmoniously. The Nords who established their country by the sea were half merchants and half bandits. Even if it was the regular army, who could say that they were completely righteous? One had to know that the expedition fleet of the Nords mainland was once a fleet formed by bandits. However, they caught the ancient Karadia Empire by surprise. And because of the split-up kingdom of Swadia were busy with internal strife, the Nords managed to gain a firm foundation. The kingdom of Nords was established. If the Karadia Empire was at its peak or if the kingdom of Swadia quickly adjusted its status in a short period of time, the kingdom of Nords, which did not have cavalry and could only use footmen on land, would have long been defeated and left this place. On land, the kingdom of Nords only had heavy footmen wielding large axes, and archers whose combat strength was close to trash. Siege and close combat might be stronger. But in the field, they were just the easy targets. Swadian heavy cavalry for practice. Swadian heavy cavalry was a level 4 troop class. However, if 100 of them charging at the same time, even if there were the same number of top-class level 6 Nord Royal Knights to block them, they would still be crushed. On the plains, the kingdom of Swadian was already the strongest country, and no one could stop them. Not bad. Kant nodded. With this water army that appeared in the river, his force would extend even faster. After all, Kant had foresight when it came to the use of the water army. For example, he could directly transport troops to the south county of the Dukedom of Leo and directly command the army to occupy Lionheart City and Lion Fort. It was not impossible to make a time difference. Opening the system, he had a lot of honor points in his mind. Draw. Kant gave the order. Soon, the colorful treasure chest appeared on his retina. At the same time, he slowly opened it. You have received a construction pack, chicken farm times 5. You have received a construction pack, bee farm times 5. You have received a construction pack, small fishing farm times 5. You have received a construction pack, tanning workshop times 5. You have received a construction pack, wheat field times 50 arcs. You have received an item pack, urban migrants times 500 people, female. You have received an item pack, rural refugees times 500 people, female. You have received a troop class pack, water bandit bosun times 50 people. You have received a troop class pack, water bandit minion times 100 people. You have received a hero pack, nomad thug Bahesh Tur. The 10 draws ended. However, there was an additional lucky draw. You have received a special pack, double the number of recruits, constant. Kant was indifferent to this. He had already developed to the point where he could be self-sufficient. Even if there was nothing in the current lucky draw, he could still live well. The only difference was that he developed fast and slowly. As his influence developed, Kant's reliance on the system decreased. This was a good way to get rid of dependence. At this time, the gift pack he got was not bad. At the very least, it could quickly upgrade the current Nord village. After all, this newly established village was still in a state of poverty. At the very least, the immigrants and troop class could solve the problem of the shortage of people. At the beginning, there were 1,000 immigrants and refugees. In addition, there was enough water army. 130 water bandit minion and 50 water bandit bosun instantly appeared by the river. The empty ground was filled with white lines. In the ancient passage, the construction team from the continent of Karadia also arrived with the carriage, carrying all kinds of wood and stones, ready to build the buildings that Kant had set up beforehand. Of course, most of them were houses and the city wall around the village. Other buildings were not built. For example, there were almost no civilian livelihood buildings. Because Kant did not intend to build any civilian livelihood buildings other than the house. This village, which he named Sargath, was like the capital of the kingdom of Nords. It was completely a new center. Kant built the artery of his force in the human countries, the castle beside the Resnistikan River. It was Kant's military center. Placing the doubling of recruitment directly on the water bandit lair, the weekly recruitment of water bandits was 60 people. On the plains not far away, cavalry riding horse, wearing leather armor, and holding spears quickly arrived. His tanned skin was very healthy, and his appearance was typical of a Kyrgyz nomad. Bahesh Tur, a nomad thug from the Kyrgyz Khanate and the famous captain of the commando cavalry, also came to this world. Lord Kant, the young nomad thug, bowed. Kant nodded calmly and said to him, "Welcome. Currently, my army needs the commander of the reconnaissance cavalry. I think you should be very suitable, and at the same time, you won't be unfamiliar with them. They are the desert bandits in the Sarand desert. Of course, I know them." Bahesh Tur did not look arrogant at all. Instead, he lowered his head humbly. "Your will is the meaning of my existence. My king, my master." Chapter 419, Kant's Journey to Destruction. Bahesh Tur was a young man from the Kyrgyz Khanate, a tribe directly under the Khan. Because his own brother was killed by someone from another tribe, the two tribes were about to engage in internal strife. Khan intervened and ordered a truce. However, as the tribe's famous irritable character, he personally went to kill the criminal. He also stole a horse from the Khan and completely left Kyrgyz Khanate, wandering in the continent of Karadia. This was also the source of his nickname as a nomadic thug. His reputation on the continent. Bahesh Tur had always been a hot-tempered, cunning, and adventurous person. Of course, after he left Kyrgyz Khanate, he did not mind becoming a horse bandit or bandit. Robbing innocent villagers and lonely trade caravan was also his basic means of earning extra money. In addition to his irritable personality and cunning mind, he also had quite a reputation in the continent of Karadia. Most importantly, He and Rolf were friends. Birds of a feather flock together. The two of them were the NPCs of the evil camp. Therefore, when Rolf returned from his patrol and saw Baheshtur, his was stunned, but he still smiled and came over to hug him. I didn't expect you to come, you damn guy. Of course, I'll do better than you when I come here. Baheshtur also smiled. The two of them were friends. They were more like a gang of scoundrels. The kindred spirits in the evil camp were more due to the relationship of interest. Compared to the people in the justice camp who appreciated and helped each other, Baheshtur and Rolf became friends because they wanted to cooperate in robbing, extorting, and kidnapping innocent people. They understood this very well, but they didn't say it clearly in front of Kant. Of course, Kant didn't care. Baheshtur was from a race on horseback, an elite from the Kyrgyz Khanate. He was better at leading the bow cavalry to attack. But because Kant didn't have the troop class of the Kyrgyz Khanate, desert bandits with similar characteristics could also become Baheshtur's troop class. They were also highly mobile and could use throwing weapons. They could come and go like the wind and were extremely ferocious. They were not bad compared to the ordinary Kyrgyz horse bandits. Baheshtur was able to command them easily. Rolf. Kant raised his head and looked at the scoundrel noble beside him. He arranged, now, you will command the water armies. Try to let these water armies enter the river in the shortest amount of time to form a battle force that can control a section of the river. Yes. Rolf nodded solemnly. I will do my best. Very good. Kant nodded. Although Rolf did not have experience in water battles, he was still a noble. His learning ability was strong. As long as he worked hard, coupled with his savage nature, he would be able to perfectly integrate into this group of water bandits. He would control warships and ride the wind and waves on the river. Then, they would be like razor of death that controlled the river was equivalent to controlling the arteries of the human countries. This was the most crucial point. When the arrangements were almost done, Kant's expression calmed down slightly. Turning his head to look at the rising tents on the plains and the temporary establishment of this huge camp, he smiled slightly and ordered, pass the order. There's no need to continue setting up camp. Yes, as the messenger, the desert bandits immediately passed down this order. Lord. Baheshtur and Rolf were slightly puzzled. Baheshtur, the new young man, also asked straightforwardly, Lord Kant, if we don't set up camp now, do we have to set off to punish your enemies? Punish? Kant smiled. No, we'll destroy them. His eyes were cold. Since those fellows from the Crimson Sect dared to attack him, they had to be prepared to be attacked by him. However, Kant did not only have a group of light cavalries, but a complete army system. Light and heavy footmen were all available, as were light and heavy cavalry. There were also long-range archers. They were all top-notch troops. Just as he said, this was not a punishment. It was destruction. Pass down the order. Kant continued to instruct, everyone take 5 days' worth of food and prepare to set off in 2 hours. Yes, the messenger quickly retreated. Along with the shout, the troops that were originally building tents instantly changed their form. From a relaxed look, they immediately changed into a nervous and solemn look. They had already adjusted their mentality and were ready to continue fighting the new enemies. Rolf, stay here and guard this village. Kant warned, nothing can go wrong here. His tone paused, he still carefully arranged, I have already asked James of Aran City to arrange a part of the supply and support troops in the underground city of the Ancient Passage. If you find a large-scale enemy gathering, then send your river troop to transport the troops over for reinforcement. Understood. Rolf nodded. I will complete the construction of the river troop in the shortest time possible. It will definitely form a strong combat force and won't drag down the village. Okay. Kant nodded. This was also the point that he was reassured about Rolf. After all, Rolf was a noble and had received all kinds of education, so he was stronger than ordinary people. As for Baheshtur, who had become the leader of the desert bandits, Kant arranged, "Follow me. Next, we will go to the depths of the East County. It is a vast plain. I think you can play a great role." "Plain? Of course, I like this terrain." Baheshtur revealed a ferocious smile. The Kahurgit people liked the plain the most. They liked it even more than the Swadian people, who were strong in cavalry. Because of the plains, the Kahurgits' warhorse could gallop without any worries. They could discover the enemy from far away, and the bows in their hands could shoot deadly arrows from far away. The troops quickly prepared the things before the expedition: food, water, fuel, and camping equipment. Everything was prepared. Then they set off. Baheshtur led the desert bandits and spread out to form a reconnaissance cavalry. The nearly 500 desert bandits had a clear grasp of the surrounding terrain. There would be no unfamiliar troops approaching them. Their reconnaissance was also very thorough. Everything was for safety. Kant personally led 20 lion knights in front. Beside them were 500 Mamluks, 1,500 Sarandian horsemen, and the other 1,500 desert bandits who controlled their speed. There were also 500 Rhodak sergeants, 1,000 Rhodak veteran spearmen, 500 Rhodak veteran crossbowmen, and 500 Ravenstern rangers who followed behind in an orderly pace. This was the main force of Kant that Crimson Sect was about to face on Mountain of Death. The main force that could be used to destroy cities and strongholds and carry out tactical attacks. If it wasn't for the ancient gods' descendants of the dead in the depths of the Naran desert, Kant would have been able to mobilize even more troops of a higher quality. They were far more powerful than what the dukedom of Leo could imagine. And now, they were also a terrifying force that no force in the East County could resist. Chapter 420, Fear in the East County. The East County was trembling in fear. On the bumpy road, a brand new and unfamiliar troop was advancing steadily in the direction of Mountain of Death. The noble, country squire, and merchant along the way were all trembling in fear. Such an elite force, such a powerful combat force. Just by looking at it, one could tell that this was an elite force. An elite force that could destroy the East County. The rich people who heard the news fled from the farms and villages along the way. Even the ordinary civilians were trembling in fear as they hid in their cellars. As for the militia that had been trained and could be organized at any time, most of them had been transferred and became the guards of the rich people. Those that could be relocated had all left. After all, it was hard to tell the motive of this army of over 6,000 people. No one knew if a gruesome war would occur. Those villages and landlords were undoubtedly the ones that would be destroyed if a war really happened. Even those trade caravan that had a high profit were timid enough to abandon the trade caravan when they encountered this terrifying army. They didn't care about the goods and fled, not daring to face it head-on. The entire East County fell into the sound of wolves coming. However, they soon discovered that this army did not do anything. Even if they rested next to the village, they only ordered the villagers to take care of their children and livestock and not to take too many steps closer to the camp. Even if some naughty and unafraid children got too close, the soldiers just scolded them. That was no punishments like whipping or anything, they were generally very kind. Even if they were to pass by the fief villages of some knights, they have done nothing. Along the way, although their reputation was getting more and more famous, and it reached to a peak. After all, it was unusual for such a large army to cross the border. If the local troops of the dukedom of Leo passed by some villages, they would have to extort a lot of silver coins. As for the unrighteous and inappropriate acts, it was even more so. After the army grew in size, they might even plunder the entire village. Not to mention the wealthy landlords and country gentry, as well as the merchants who had a lot of goods, they would just plunder it all. But now, this army surprised the people. Not only the civilians, but even the landlords and merchants, as well as the noble families, were secretly surprised. At the same time, they were even more curious about the ownership of this unfamiliar army. However, news quickly spread. After all, it was not a secret that the Crimson Sect was going to the west of the East County to carry out military activities. As for the fact that the attacker was Kant, who had just left the East County city, everyone already understood. They also understood in their hearts. Why did this powerful army head to Mountain of Death? It was because in the current East County, as long as one had a certain level in class, they would know that the real person in charge was no longer Countess Agatha that was hiding in the city. Instead, it was Viscount Gibran, who was in charge of the Crimson Sect. He had once stirred up a storm in the Dukedom of Leo, the Silver Platter Kingdom, and the entire human countries. The Crimson Sect was a new sect formed by the remnants of the demon worship cult. Since Kant had led this army to Mountain of Death, there was naturally no need to say much. It would be impossible to say that Kant was not after Crimson Sect. After all, there was no reason for the army to return empty-handed after crossing the border. Only battle achievements were everything. The Crimson Sect of the Mountain of Death was in danger. But more noble families were secretly frightened. Frightened and timid. Kant's army's origin made them imagine. From the riverbank of the Resnistikan River, a powerful army had mysteriously appeared. It was more than half a month's journey from the Naran Desert. Since it couldn't be the army of the Naran Desert, there might be another explanation. The foundation left behind by Princess Sophia, the mother of Baron Kant. Or rather, it might be the troops of the Silver Platter Kingdom. Only this situation could explain the current situation. Otherwise, the noble families who were still in the dark had no way to explain where Baron Kant's troops came from, where they were hiding, and how they suddenly appeared in here. After all, in their impression, they could not imagine that Kant would have countless worlds to support him. These noble families did not dare to act rashly either. They only gathered the troops. Dark. They urgently closed all the doors of communication to the outside world. Or they gathered together and formed a militia force that looked barely qualified to protect themselves. At the same time, they contacted the surrounding great noble families to form an offensive and defensive alliance and carefully set up their own defenses. They were neutral and did not intend to support or offend anyone. They allowed Kant's troops to cross the border in their estate. It was as if they could not see it. They also allowed the Crimson Sect to urgently mobilize their own spies and send their believers to Mountain of Death to set up defenses. Both sides had already shed all pretenses of cordiality. The only reason why they did not start a war was because Kant had not reached his destination, and the crazy believers on Mountain of Death had not yet prepared their weapons and reorganized the battle forces. It could be predicted that when Kant's troops arrived at Mountain of Death, everything would cease to exist. The war would begin on the most famous mountain in the East County. However, the Crimson Sect was very confident in winning. Viscount Gibran, once the famous general of the East County and now the chief of the Crimson Sect, was ready. He was once a serious military noble who stood out from a series of blood and fire. Even in the crazed and stubborn Crimson Sect, he was the only one who had the qualifications and ability to be the chief and military commander. He could only reveal his true identity to Kant, who had made him suffer a great loss. He was angry. He was mad. According to his plan, he still had at least 3 years before he was exposed. At that time, the entire East County's noble families would be infiltrated by the Crimson Sect. In addition, he had already contacted some of the top noble families in the South County. When that time came, the East County would be under his control. Although he would have to give a portion of the benefits to those greedy fellows in the South County. However, Gibran did not care. That great existence was standing behind him. It was a legendary supreme creature, an existence that could contend with the national religion of Leo, the god of war, Edmund. At that time, not to mention the dukedom of Leo, he would even not afraid of Silver Platter Kingdom. This was because after controlling the vast majority of the resources in the Eastern County territory, that supreme existence would be able to revive, allowing him to obtain absolute power. Feeling the power that had already far surpassed that of a grand knight, he thought about that terrifying existence in the legends, Gibran could not help but shudder. This was excitement. Desire. An insane desire to possess. As for Kant, this little fellow, Gibran was actually extremely disdainful of him. He even mocked at him. When they reached Mountain of Death, the battle group formed by those crazy believers would be able to get rid of them.